Class 8. Subject Social Studies. Lesson 6 Weavers, Iron Smelters and Factory Owners. Q1. During which period patola weaving was famous? Ans. Patola weaving was famous in mid-19th century. Q2. Why were bellows used? Ans. Bellows were used for pumping air that kept the charcoal burning. Q3. When and where was the first cotton mill set up in India? Ans. The first cotton mill in India was set up as a spinning mill in Bombay in 1854. Q4. What were piece goods? Ans. Piece goods were usually woven cloth pieces that were 20 yards long and 1 yard wide. Q5. What is jamdani? Ans. Jamdani is a fine muslin on which decorative motifs are woven on the loom, typically in grey and white. Q6. What were the most important centers of jamdani weaving? Ans. The most important centers of jamdani weaving were Dhaka in Bengal and Lucknow in the United Provinces. Q7. Name the place where chintz was produced during the mid-19th century. Ans. Chintz was produced in Masulipatam, Andhra Pradesh, in mid-19th century. Q8. What did Mahatma Gandhi urge people during national movement? Ans. During the national movement, Mahatma Gandhi urged people to boycott imported textiles and use handspun and hand-woven cloth. Q9. How did Indian cotton factories prove to be helpful during the First World War? Ans. During the First World War, when textile imports from Britain declined and Indian factories were called upon to produce cloth for military supplies. Q10. What was special about Tipu Sultan's sword? Or, why was Tipu's sword so special? Ans. Tipu's sword was made from special type of high carbon steel called woods. Woods steel when made into swords produced a very sharp edge with a flowing water pattern. Q11. What is smelting? Ans. Smelting is the process of obtaining a metal from rock or soil by heating it to a very high temperature, or of melting objects made from metal in order to use the metal to make something new. Q12. Why Britain came to be known as the workshop of the world? Ans. Mechanized production of cotton textiles made Britain the foremost industrial nation in the 19th century. And when its iron and steel industry started growing from the 1850s, Britain came to be known as the workshop of the world. Q13. How were Indian textiles viewed in the world market? Or, mention the importance of Indian textiles in the world market. Ans. Indian textiles had long been renowned both for their fine quality and exquisite craftsmanship. They were extensively traded in Southeast Asia and West and Central Asia. From the 16th century, European trading companies began buying Indian textiles for sale in Europe. Q14. Who were weavers? Name some communities famous for weaving. Ans. Weavers often belonged to communities that specialized in weaving. Their skills were passed on from one generation to the next. The Tanti weavers of Bengal, the Julahas or Momin weavers of North India, Sale and Kai Kolar and Devangs of South India are some of the communities famous for weaving. Q15. What was Calico Act? Ans. By the early 18th century, worried by the popularity of Indian textiles, wool and silk makers in England began protesting against the import of Indian cotton textiles. In 1720, the British government enacted a legislation banning the use of printed cotton textiles gents in England. Interestingly, this act was known as the Calico Act. Q16. What happened to the weavers and spinners who lost their livelihood? Ans. Many weavers became agricultural laborers. Some migrated to cities in search of work, and yet others went out of the country to work in plantations in Africa and South America. Some of these handloom weavers also found work in the new cotton mills that were established in Bombay, now Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Sholapur, Nagpur and Kanpur. Q17. Why did the wool and silk producers in England protest against the import of Indian textiles in the early 18th century? Ans. Textile industries had just begun to develop in England in the early 18th century. Unable to compete with Indian textiles, English producers wanted a secure market within the country by preventing the entry of Indian textiles. Therefore, they protested against the import of Indian textiles. Q18. What problems did the Indian textile industry face in the early years of its development? Ans. The textile factory industry in India faced many problems. It found it difficult to compete with the cheap textiles imported from Britain. In most countries, governments supported industrialization by imposing heavy duties on imports. This eliminated competition and protected infant industries. The colonial government in India usually refused such protection to local industries. Q19. Write a short note on growth of cotton mills in India. Or, give a brief description of growth of cotton mills in India. Ans. The first cotton mill in India was set up as a spinning mill in Bombay in 1854. By 1900, over 84 mills started operating in Bombay. Mills came up in other cities too. The first mill in Ahmedabad was started in 1861. A year later a mill was established in Kanpur, in the United Provinces. Growth of cotton mills led to a demand for labor. Thousands of poor peasants, artisans and agricultural laborers moved to the cities to work in the mills. Q20. Why was the wood's steel making process completely lost by the mid-19th century? Or, wood's steel making process was completely lost by the mid-19th century. Give reasons. Or, wood's steel making process was completely lost by the mid-19th century. Why this was so? Ans. Wood's steel making process was completely lost by the mid-19th century because of the following reasons. I. The swords and armor making industry died with the conquest of India by the British. 2. Imports of iron and steel from England displaced the iron and steel produced by craftspeople in India. Q21. How did the invention of spinning jenny and steam engine revolutionized cotton textiles move in England? Ans. Competition with Indian textiles led to a search for technological innovation in England. In 1764, the spinning jenny was invented by John Kay, which increased the productivity of the traditional spindles. The invention of the steam engine by Richard Richter in 1786 revolutionized cotton textile weaving. Cloth could now be woven in immense quantities and cheaply too. Q22. What helped Tisco expand steel production during the First World War? Ans. By the time Tisco was set up, the situation was changing. In 1914 the First World War broke out. Steel produced in Britain now had to meet the demands of war in Europe. So, imports of British steel into India declined dramatically and the Indian Railways turned to Tisco for supply of rails. As the war dragged on for several years, Tisco had to produce shells and carriage wheels for the war. By 1919 the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by Tisco. Over time Tisco became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. Q23. Describe the process of weaving. Ans. Process of weaving. The first stage of production was spinning, a work done mostly by women. The charkha and the takli were household spinning instruments. The thread was spun on the charkha and rolled on the takli. When the spinning was over, the thread was woven into cloth by the weaver. In most communities weaving was a task done by men. For colored textiles, the thread was dyed by the dyer, known as rangaras. For printed cloth the weavers needed the help of specialist block printers known as cheapigars. Q24. Why did handloom weaving not completely die in India? Ans. Handloom weaving did not completely die in India. This was because some types of cloths could not be supplied by machines. For example, machines could not produce saris with intricate borders or cloths with traditional woven patterns. These had a wide demand not only amongst the rich but also amongst the middle classes. Nor did the textile manufacturers in Britain produce the very coarse cloths used by the poor people in India. 3. Sholapur in western India and Madura in South India emerged as important new centers of weaving in the late 19th century. 4. Later, during the national movement, Mahatma Gandhi urged people to boycott imported textiles and use handspun and hand-woven cloth. Khadi gradually became a symbol of nationalism. Q25. How did the development of cotton industries in Britain affect textile producers in India? Ans. The development of cotton industries in Britain affected textile producers in India in several ways. Indian textiles now had to compete with British textiles in the European and American markets. Exporting textiles to England also became increasingly difficult since very high duties were imposed on Indian textiles imported into Britain. 3. By the beginning of the 19th century, English-made cotton textiles successfully ousted Indian goods from their traditional markets in Africa, America and Europe. 4. Thousands of weavers in India were now thrown out of employment. Bengal weavers were the worst hit. By the 1830s British cotton cloth flooded Indian markets. This affected not only specialist weavers but also spinners. Q26. How do the names of different textiles tell us about their histories? Ans. It is interesting to trace the names of different textiles as it tells us about their histories. Muslin. European traders first encountered fine cotton cloth from India carried by Arab merchants in Mosul in present-day Iraq. So, they began referring to all finely woven textiles as muslin. Calico. When the Portuguese first came to India in search of spices, they landed in Calicut on the Kerala coast in southwest India. The cotton textiles which they took back to Europe, along with the spices, came to be called calico, derived from Calicut, and subsequently calico became the general name for all cotton textiles. Chintz. It is derived from the Hindi word chint, a cloth with small and colorful flowery designs. Bandana. The word bandana now refers to any brightly colored and printed scarf for the neck or head. Originally, the term derived from the word bandana, Hindi for tying, and referred to a variety of brightly colored cloth produced through a method of tying and dyeing, Q27. Why did the Indian iron smelting industry decline in the 19th century? Ans. Indian iron smelting industry began to decline in the 19th century due to the following reasons. The new forest law. Colonial government prevented people from entering the reserved forests. Thus, the iron smelters were not able to find wood for charcoal and iron ore for producing iron. 2. Defying forest laws, they often entered the forests secretly and collected wood, but they could not sustain their occupation on this basis for long. Many gave up their craft and looked for other means of livelihood. 3. In some areas the government did grant access to the forest, but the iron smelters had to pay a very high tax to the forest department for every furnace they used. This reduced their income. 4. Moreover, by the late 19th century iron and steel was being imported from Britain. Ironsmiths in India began using the imported iron to manufacture utensils and implements. This inevitably lowered the demand for iron produced by local smelters.